So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I hope a few more people will trickle in, I hope, but we weren't expecting this to be a huge crowd. As Andy said, I'm Mark Winne, and I've been involved in community food work and food policy work and food policy council work for my pretty much my entire career, which feels incredibly long these days. And we really just wanted to take this opportunity to, um, you know, find out what we can do, if anything, to assist you and your the grantees, programs, projects, communities in developing your capacity to do more food policy work. And in order for me to sort of talk about that, I am going to give you a short presentation with the intent of just giving you kind of an overview of policy, food policy, public policy, but also to acquaint you with just some basics of food policy councils. Now, I recognize, of course, that many of you have been involved in policy, or maybe even with food policy councils. I don't know. Do we have a way of finding out, raising hands here, or if I was to ask you how many of you have any association at all with the Food Council or Food Policy Council? Is there a way to do that, Emma? Or you just raise your hand so I can see you, but I just see one so far. A few people that are on. I can't see them, but so we're gonna be not going really too deeply into the weeds on any of this, just because this again is an overview, and I really am very interested in teasing out from you what your interests might be in pursuing more policy work, perhaps as a part of your programs or your projects now. If you may be involved already with some group that is doing policy, then maybe you want to enhance that somehow or to expand it, so we can have a conversation about those options. But I want to leave you with at least knowing what I can do and what our project, our training and technical assistance project, can do to assist you with your interests. So that's the main purpose here. I am available to work with you on policy and food policy council. So I would be probably the point person on any future training or technical assistance effort. I should let you know that just so you have some belief in me, that I've been involved in food policy and food policy councils for a very long time. I started the Hartford Food System Food Policy Commission in the early to mid 1990s. I later started the state of Connecticut Food Policy Council. And I now live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I played a role in developing the Santa Fe Food Policy Council and also the New Mexico State Food Policy Council. So I've worked with dozens, probably hundreds of organizations, communities, and so forth in various areas of policy and improving sometimes food policy council. So I have quite a bit of experience. That being said, the field is changing all the time, and what we know about community dynamics and community food systems and food policy changes a lot. The things that I was perhaps most engaged in, say 10 years ago, have changed to some degree, and there are other interests have arisen. So it's not like I'm the ultimate authority on the topic. We keep it reinventing and coming up with different ways to talk about, act on, and the priorities change as well. So I respect that a lot, and simply want to provide you with a basic framework so we can start the conversation. Make sure there's anything else I wanted to. I think that's it. So we can go right into the first slide, if you don't mind. When I like to talk about policy as something that we have the right to do, because I love this little Buddhist statement that things that are important in our life, in our community, shouldn't be decided by one person. And somehow every time I read that and I think about what's going on today in the world in a certain higher level of authoritarianism becoming more pervasive, I come back to this and remind myself that this is a very basic principle that I think we want to live our lives by, and we want to live our communities, we want our communities to live by this notion as well. And nothing applies more, in my mind, to this than food and food systems. So we can go to the next slide. It also applies to democracy and what we've talked about as food democracy. The question a lot of people ask who are finding themselves doing community food work. They might be starting gardens, urban gardens, or maybe they're starting, urban or farms. They're trying to figure out how to improve access to healthy and affordable food. They're taking on a whole number of issues in their community, helping, working with, working on equity, working on sustainability. Why does any of that matter? Well, to me, it often comes down not just to the projects themselves, not just to the hands-on work that you're doing, but also to what the larger, community level of support and concern is for that type of work. So I think about food systems and food policy in the sense of how what an essential part of democracy it is. There just isn't anything in my mind that's as intimate in terms of our lives as food. And, that again, it provides a reason to become engaged. And we live in a capitalist system, driven by a marketplace. We may not like it, we may not like the outcomes, but, for now, it's a reality. And about the only thing in my mind that has been able to corral capitalism or push back against some of the, let's call them mandates of the marketplace, has been policy, public policy, being engaged in getting the system to change. It's very difficult to find another place where you can actually make that change occur. So I use the term countervailing force, that public policy is a countervailing force to the marketplace. But policy comes from government. It comes also from large institutions, including private ones. It can be hospitals, it can be schools, have policies. But for the most part, we're talking about government. And I particularly like the notion that, to push back against the idea that society is more than a marketplace, food is more than a commodity, people are more than consumers. We are more than all those things. And I think that's why we do the food work that we do. We do the community food work, and we look at how we can make democracy work in that context. And so far, the best means I've found for trying to do that work, do policy work particularly at a community level or at a local level, state level too, have been food policy councils. They are essentially a democratic enterprise. They're communal and they're strongly committed to promoting sustainability and an equitable food system. So let's go to the next one. When we're thinking about policy and let's say we have an action we want to take. There's something we want to do in our community, and we feel that we need some kind of government action to make it happen. One thing that's important to know from the outset, it's just a very basic thing, is like which level of government do we go to make that thing happen? Sometimes it's local, sometimes it's your town hall, your county offices, your county commission, or your tribal community, your tribal administration. Other times it's the state that you live in. And other times it's the federal government. Those are the different levels of policy, the action that are taken. For instance, if I wanted to start a farmer's market and I needed land or some site to do it, the policy action that I'm going to take is probably going to be working with my town, with the town hall or my county. If I want to try to get more support for vouchers and to make sure that lower income families can participate at that farmers market, as we do with various types of programs. Sometimes we can go to the state government and we can get funding from that. But if we want to say we want to change the whole SNAP program, well, that kind of effort is going to be directed at the national level. So I don't want to try to parse this too much right now, but it's important to know where you go when you want to take some policy action, which level of government, where you start. And sometimes they're all kind of commingled and it can be very confusing, but um, eventually you'll find your way. And there's there's kind of a labyrinth you might have to follow to get to the point where you can actually make some change. Let's go to the next slide. This is just an example of, this is again, going back to my earlier statement that, how the marketplace works and the kind of system that our food system operates in. I like this quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, the Nobel economist, passed away a long time ago, but I think it's important that left to themselves, economic forces don't work out for the best except for the most powerful. Again, that's why we harness the power of policy to try to push back against that. And I use this, this is a way that we can balance the marketplace. For instance, in all the work that I've done with farmers markets over the years, it's always been disconcerting that, in order to serve the farmers well, we need to have better prices for them. Sometimes those prices may be too high. And that excludes a certain portion of the community. We have traditionally addressed that by various kinds of voucher programs, the GusNIP program, the veggie scripts. All of these have been ways to sort of balance or rebalance the marketplace. And again, where do you go with that? You can get assistance from the local sources. You can certainly get them from your state legislature, and you can certainly apply for federal grants. Going back to, let's say, about the late 1990s, none of these programs existed. When we were trying to organize farmers markets and trying to find a way to make sure they were accessible to everybody in our community, we had to invent this stuff from scratch. And it would often involve just going to our state legislature and asking for money to try to support coupon programs. And it led eventually to the very first federal coupon program, which is the WIC, Farmers Market Nutrition Program. But that's the progression. That's how policy works. And so far, that's how we've been using it to address what are fundamentally the inequities of the marketplace. So let's go on to the next slide. And the way we've often worked through these challenges have been food policy councils. And I leave you just with this little, one thing I want to say right from the outset, should have said it earlier, is that we use the term food policy council, knowing full well that not everybody uses that term. Sometimes these groupings are called food councils. Sometimes they're called food system networks, food equity councils. I've heard that several times. There's quite a number of variations on the name itself. But just for our conversation today, I just want to use food policy councils, knowing that hopefully that means that we're applying it to all the different groups that come together in this fashion as an organized group of stakeholders from various sectors working on food system issues. Sometimes they are a part of government. Many food policy councils have become a part of government, which in some ways is good because it speaks to the progression of interest on the part of government about food and food systems. Again, you don't have to go back too far to find a place where local and state governments were largely indifferent to everything about food and food systems, doing very little. Today, for the most part, they acknowledge they do have a role to play, and their participation in food policy councils has grown substantially. But also food policy councils can be independent, completely independent of government. They can operate as a nonprofit organization. They can operate under the auspices of an existing nonprofit organization. There's many variations on how they can operate. But the idea basically is that they are simply an organization of local stakeholders, including people with lived experience in those communities. That shouldn't be neglected. These aren't just experts, they aren't just professionals, though you will certainly find a substantial number of those folks from different food backgrounds. Farmers, of course, are members of food policy councils. And the whole structure of membership can be, is a whole different conversation, a little more complicated. People tend to keep it fairly open, but also trying to come up with, at least some smaller groupings so that decisions can be made with some, relatively efficiently. A lot of committees, a lot of working groups, that kind of thing is a way to engage many people in the work of a food policy council. So let's go on to the next slide, which just shows you the growth in food policy councils over the years. There's been a huge growth, in fact, since wherever 2007, 2008. We sort of, Andy mentioned that I work with Johns Hopkins, the Center for a Livable Future, something called the Food Policy Network Project. We've done a lot of research on food policy councils, a lot of surveys, a lot of census type work. And that's how we arrived at these numbers, which, right now we're looking at somewhere around 300 food policy councils in the US. You also got a good number of food policy councils in Canada as well. We're also in the process of doing a new survey, new census. So these numbers will change a little bit, probably sometime in the next year, but we expect they're going to stay somewhere in the same range, but really rapid growth over the last 10 years or so. Next slide. Why do we have a food policy council? Well, I've sort of talked about it in generalities, but largely it does exist to influence food policy. I mean, that's the main purpose. But I'd say the other second to that is, and just as important, is the need to coordinate efforts of food system stakeholders within a specified geography and jurisdictions. There's been so much growth in food system work, food projects, so much diversity. It's really astounding how much things have exploded over the last 20 years or so. And you could begin to see that groups in the community were bumping into each other, sometimes competing unnecessarily, not taking on issues that they could best address as a grouping rather than trying to take them on individually. So all that power of coalition and organization was lost when there was no way for all that sort of emerging food system and food project interest to go. So to a large degree, food policy councils are about coordination, but they're also about policy. Now, occasionally they'll get into projects. There have been projects, meaning they will actually go and do something. But the important thing I think to remember is that the council itself doesn't take the place of its members, of the work of its members, the projects that they're doing. If there's an urban gardening farming organization that's a member, it's usually not appropriate for the council to go off and take on its own urban or any kind of farm or garden project when you already have a member doing that work. Sometimes there's a need for a little demonstration. Nobody else can do that project. There's just nobody around. It's a way to sort of make a statement or a point. Sometimes under those circumstances, it makes sense for the Food Policy Council to take on a project, but generally they should stay focused on sort of the policy work. They should be doing food assessments, preparing food plans. Knowing what's going on in your community is so important. Who are the players, where are the resources, what's been done before, what are the needs. These are important tasks for a Food Policy Council. as such, they really become almost like they're like a department of food, I sometimes call them. It's sort of ironic, I think, that, given how important food is, um, yet that we don't have a department of food at the local level or the state level. Even the national level, a lot of people have sort of suggested that USDA be renamed the Department of Food. Um, that idea didn't seem to get very far with the Farm Bureau and others like that, but it, you know, that we again, it sort of speaks to the fact that there's sort of a void in the way the government thinks about food. So food policy councils almost become that kind of entity. Um, and I won't go into all the deep, but you see that it is very representative of different sectors and segments of your food system and your community. And I think most importantly, or as importantly as my sort of top two coordination of food policy is the need to be the voice of the community. You are speaking up often on behalf of people whose voices don't get heard often or well. And the community is coming together to say what it needs. And you need to channel that. You need to be in a position to be able to say, hey folks, we're not doing this work well. We're not helping this group of people. Or here is a need that is emerging that we haven't addressed fully. So you have to be able to speak up and be that voice. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one. I think I've sort of gone through it enough. Just a quick look at how the structures and jurisdictions of food policy councils. You can see that they cross different jurisdictional lines. Some are based in a county, just in a county. Others are just in a particular city, and some are a combination of both. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we have a Santa Fe city and county food policy council. Some are increasingly more are regional. We're seeing more that are multi-county, or there's one I've worked with a food policy council in Northwest Kansas, a very rural area that's made up of nine counties that constitute its regional food policy council, and then states. So there's various reasons to do it this way that I won't go into now, but usually there's some thought given to what jurisdiction, what geography you want to cover, and then how are they organized. Again, you can see here sort of a number based on this data is a little bit old. It'll be updated in our next survey, but it gives you a sense of where they're located within nonprofits, within government. A few cases they're with universities or extension service. We've seen some under United Ways. Really, almost anything that can work. I mean, there's really no hard and fast rules. I think there's certain choices that can be made based on some analysis. This is the kind of thing I would do with groups individually to help you kind of think through your best options. But this gives you a sense of what the variety is. Next slide. Here's some, just to actually get into some nitty gritty. All right, what are some policies? What do we mean by local policies? Urban agriculture has become very big, and just some examples of from giving people permission to actually raise animals. Chickens has been sort of one of the more popular animals. Tax incentives to put vacant land in urban areas into urban farming. Maybe one of my favorite little stories is about Orlando, Florida, where here's an opportunity arises that can advance your cause, take advantage of it. In this example at Orlando, a couple were homeowners in a sort of dense suburban area in Orlando, fairly dense neighborhood. And they decided to turn their front yard, they had a small front yard, turn it into a garden. Well, it turned out there was some ancient law on the books that said you can't turn your front yard into a vegetable garden. You only can use it for grass. And somebody complained when they did it, and the couple received a citation for growing a vegetable garden in their front yard. Well, this turned into kind of a big cause. People in the community thought this was ridiculous. Why are they trying to fine these people for growing food? And it all got things stirred up in City Hall. So ultimately, they weren't fined. In fact, Orlando went into a major campaign to figure out how it could grow more food in the city, and all kinds of policies and actions and groups, an Orlando Food Policy Council, and other things, among other things, sprung out of this one effort. And so if something comes along and somebody does something, a city hall does something really dumb, kind of throws you a softball, you can whack it out of the park and use it as something you can turn into maybe some policy victories down the road. Other policy methods that have become popular is, procurement, using good food purchasing program as a sort of a model of, bringing our values into the food purchasing that's made by institutions. These are institutions that come under public control, like schools, hospitals, and so forth. You as a policy council and as citizens can speak up on what food you're buying. Is it local? How is it produced? Does it maximize other values that you care about? In Springfield, Massachusetts, the city developed a culinary facility. Double Up Bucks has been used, as I said before, to help SNAP recipients and many other groups to participate in farmers markets, including funding coming from the city or itself. I have an example here of Boise, Idaho, which actually funded their Double Up Bucks program. Food waste has become a major topic, and many cities are taking up the task of trying to reduce their waste, create compost, and otherwise just make for a greener, more food secure city. Public transportation has often been cited as an opportunity to connect people to local food, or not local food, but to food outlets. I'll give you an example in a few minutes from my days in Hartford. And certainly trying to bring good food retail of different types into food deserts has been one of the big topics of policy. Next slide. Okay, this is actually going to be my last slide. This is from my work with the Food Policy Council in Hartford, Connecticut, just to give you some very more hands-on idea what we can do. We actually found at one point that, first of all, I should say that Hartford was very much of a food desert. When I started doing my work there, there was only one or two supermarket chains still operating in a very low-income city. All the chains had moved to the suburbs, and we found that the supermarkets were actually giving better deals, better prices, and coupons to people living in the suburbs as opposed to those living in the city who needed that assistance more. We actually took that case to the state legislature and pointed it out to some fairly powerful legislators who were able to actually force the supermarket industry to agree to stop that practice. We found that our city school, our school breakfast programs were not being utilized well, partly because there were various problems in the way the schools operated and some hostile attitudes on the part of school principals, where we were able to change that and dramatically increase the amount of children participating in the breakfast program. One big example was with our WIC program, which was operated by the city health department. And because of some bureaucratic snafus, they had actually lost about 6,000 people, families in their caseload because of some changes in their clinics. And they didn't do anything to try to help those people find new ways of accessing the program. They just let them drop out. So our Food Policy Council made a big stink out of that and was able to rectify that problem in a very short period of time. I think the point is that somebody's paying attention. somebody in your community is paying attention to what is going on with your food and your food system. And that's a really, you're bearing witness in a way to what is happening in your place. And it's important for you to, own, sort of take on that charge and assume that role as sort of an ombudsman, so that when something goes wrong, or if something just isn't right, you got to be there to speak up. And what a I'm just gonna, and then we did a whole project with connecting low income neighborhoods to suburban supermarkets by rerouting the public transportation system. The buses just didn't take people to supermarkets. So we had to do a lot of advocacy and research in order to make that case to change the bus routes so that we didn't make those connections. At a state level, we were able to bring attention to the fact that we were losing a tremendous amount of farmland to development, and we needed a more robust farm preservation program, which we did accomplish through a lot of advocacy and public education. So I'm going to leave it there. I wanted to just give you a sense of what some of the the importance of policy in our food system, the role that food policy councils and similar organizations can play, the role of citizenship, and even to the other terms like food sovereignty, where we can't achieve food sovereignty unless we have an activated food citizenship. So it's one thing to be a good food consumer. It's one thing to be a good nonprofit organization doing good food projects, but we also need to be more intentional in the way that we think about our food system. And that food policy council. I should note, I didn't spend any time talking about assessments and food plans. Often that's one of the very first things that a food policy council does. It provides you with a guide, both in terms of identifying the needs that your community has, but what action steps you want to take and who's going to do it.